All right, welcome back. This is Unit 5 that we are getting started into, and this is all about the Constitutional Convention and then the critical period that came after with ratification. So let's get started. The 1780s were arguably the most critical period in America's history. So, from the War for Independence to the ratification of the Constitution, those years were characterized by conflict and change. At the start of the decade, for example, British troops patrolled the streets of New York City in the name of King George III. By the decade's end, American citizens paraded through the same streets to celebrate the inauguration of another George, President George Washington. Americans changed governments twice during the 1780s. They threw off the British rule through success on the battlefield, but then they scrapped their national confederation because of its weakness and they set up a new form of government. Oh, so sorry. Let me go back there. This is from 1781 to 1789. Americans made their greatest contribution to political thought and practice during this period. We have the writing of the Constitution, and the Constitution capped the independence movement and provided a stable national government through which the states were united in more than name only. The Constitution gave substance to the spirit of 76. So, to understand the Constitution, we must understand first the Confederation. So on June 7th, 1776, the Second Continental Congress voted to draw up a charter for joining the colonies into a confederation. This is a close alliance between sovereign states. So, for instance, today the EU is an example of a confederation. Um, During the Civil War in the United States, the South was a confederation. Think of it as a loose friendship. So, right, this close alliance or loose friendship of sovereign states. Congress entrusted the task to a committee headed by John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, and in a little more than a month, Dickinson's committee presented its work. After more than a year of debate and revision, Congress adopted the Articles of Confederation, and by 1781, all 13 states had approved the Articles and they went into effect. So, Dickinson originally proposed establishing a strong central government. However, the states, jealous of their power and fearing centralization, watered down the plan majorly. So the Articles of Confederation did little more than grant legitimacy to the loosely constructed Continental Congress and provide the minimum authority needed to conduct war. Although the states pledged themselves to perpetual union, they committed themselves only to a firm league of friendship with each other. The article said plainly each state retains its sovereignty, freedom, and independence. So, in effect, the central government was only as strong as the states allowed it to become, which was not very strong at all. The legislature was the only component of the Confederation government. So we did not have a presidency at this point. There is no executive, there's no king, there's no executive branch, and there's also no judicial branch. It is only a legislative branch in the Confederation. So the Congress of the Confederation was unicameral. Unicameral is an important word for you to know. It means they only had one house or only one legislative house that did the work of creating laws. So each state legislature could elect 2 to 7 representatives to attend, but each state only had one vote, regardless of how many representatives it sent. Important legislation, such as declaring war, approving treaties, and coining money, creating money, had to be approved by at least 9 states. But amending and ratifying the articles required a unanimous consent of all 13 states, which is incredibly hard to get. The articles simply formalized how the 13 states were functioning historically, politically, and economically. Therefore, the article reserved to the states every power, jurisdiction, and right that was not expressly delegated to Congress. So if it wasn't spelled out, Congress does this, the states always had that power. So, among the most important powers that were reserved to the states, because they weren't specifically said to go to Congress, was the power to tax. Congress could not levy taxes. And in fact, Congress was forced to ask the states for money. And it was a request that the states, they ignored it. Most of them did if they wished. And so the central government was reduced to scraping funds together through loans from other nations, which they generally were not the best at repaying. They also made a little money from the sale of public lands in the frontier, but that was about it. So, despite its glaring weaknesses and ultimate failure, the Confederation achieved a few successes. Chief among them were the Treaty of Paris and the settlement of the Western Lands Dispute. Now, this is just to show you real quick the three systems of government that are common throughout history as far as like power division. So there is unitary, which was what England is still an example of, where you have one strong central government and then you have multiple weaker state governments that only have power because the strong central government gave them power. So think of unitary government as an octopus. The leg only has power because the octopus head is alive. That's unitary. Then we have confederation, which is a very weak central government and strong state governments. That's what we just talked about with the Articles of Confederation. And then we have federal, which is equally strong but different powers. So federal, you have a strong central government that is in relationship to strong state governments, and they have some powers that are specific to them, like only national government powers and only state reserve powers, but then they also have shared powers. And so that is what the Constitutional Convention is going to create is the federal system of government, and that is how we function today. So, here's a couple of the successes of the Articles of Confederation, even though it had a lot of weaknesses. The Treaty of Paris was the Confederation's greatest triumph in foreign affairs. By forcing the Great Britain to recognize American independence, the treaty built enormous prestige for the young nation. At the same time, enforcement of the treaty revealed the weaknesses of the Confederation, and they squandered much of that reputation that the United States had carefully built. Then we have the Western lands, and the big thing you need to know here is the Northwest Ordinance of 1784. So, let me see where I want to start here. The Treaty of Paris left the United States in control of all territory east of the Mississippi River and north of Florida and Louisiana. Several states, notably Virginia and New York, claimed parts of that huge tract of land, and others didn't have any claim on it. And Maryland was one of those. They had no claim on these Western lands, and therefore Maryland was not going to ratify the articles unless the other states abandoned their claims and turned this land over to the federal government. When Virginia and New York agreed to yield their claim to the national government, the others eventually followed, and Maryland ratified the articles. So, north of the Ohio River, all land that passed into the hands of the national government became known as the Northwest Territory. So the Ohio River runs through Ohio, Wisconsin, kind of along the borders of Kentucky, North Carolina, and Georgia, down all the way, I guess that would be Louisiana area. So the question of how to develop and govern the Northwest Territory was settled by a series of ordinances. And the first and most cited one is the Ordinance of 1784. And then eventually it will get to 87. So 84, it was written by Thomas Jefferson, and he proposed creating 10 new states out of the territory, each of which would be equal to the other states in the Union. And he also proposed banning slavery in the region and giving the land to the settlers instead of selling it. Unfortunately, the ordinance was so far-sighted that it never went into effect. Too many states feared the creation of 10 new states. Then we have the Land Ordinance of 85 that was far more cautious and avoided thorny political questions like slavery, and instead it concentrated on the settlement of the territory. The ordinance divided the new lands into townships that were for sale and also required development. Each township contained 36 sections or lots of 1 square mile, aka 640 acres, and each lot was to be sold for $1 an acre. So you could get a township for $640. So not free land like Jefferson hoped. All right, so 84, I associate that with Jefferson. It did not happen. 85, we see a division of territory, $640 for a township. Then we have the one that stuck, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. So, whereas the Ordinance of 85 concerned settlement, the Ordinance of 87 concerned government. The Northwest Territory was to be divided into at least three, but no more than five states. Each would be state when, sorry, each would be state when it went through three different stages. So to become a state, it had to go through three different stages. In the first stage, the region remained almost completely under the control of the federal government. And federal and national, those are synonyms, okay? So I'm going to use them interchangeably. Federal means national, national means federal. So when a region had at least 5,000 free inhabitants, it entered the second stage and became a territory. The people could then elect a legislature and send a representative to Congress. However, the governor was still appointed by the national government and could veto any act passed by the territorial legislature. So, other provisions were also noteworthy. Building on the educational provisions of the Land Ordinance of 85, the 87 ordinance explicitly emphasized the importance of education. It said, this is a quote, religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. Most importantly, the ordinance followed Jefferson's original suggestion and prohibited slavery in the new territories. Also, most states that entered the Union afterwards followed the political process set down by the Northwest Ordinance. And that's the kicker. That's the thing I want you to remember the most about the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. It made a system for new states to join the Union equal to other states. So we created a method that our country could stably grow by. And no slavery in these potential new states. These ordinances were the greatest success of the Confederate government. This is the area that we're talking about, Northwest Territories. So you see where I was talking about um, Ohio, Indiana, Iowa, and then along the edge of the Kentucky, Tennessee area. We don't consider this West today, but at the time it was considered the West. Now we just think of it as the North. So let's look at some of the failures of the Confederation, and then I think that's probably where we'll get to today. So failures. There's three big categories of failures that you need to understand for the Articles of Confederation. The new nation's financial situation was understandably dire after a 6-year war on its soil. The weaknesses of the Articles did not help. The national government was almost always in debt, and the individual states were not much better off. Hard money, aka silver and gold, was very scarce, hardly there. But paper money, the obvious answer to a lack of hard money, presented its own difficulties. During the war, the national government had printed so much money, and it was called continental dollars, that paper money's value plummeted, and the merchants would not even accept it. The expression not worth a continental, if you've ever heard that before, I don't know, it's getting kind of old now, but if it's not worth a continental, this is what it's referencing. The expression came to mean that something is worthless, and it's because the continental dollars were worthless. Compounding the problem was each state's ability to print its own currency. State currency was often as worthless as the continental notes, and many merchants required payment in hard currency or barter goods. So you either had to pay gold or silver or barter goods for like, I'll take 3 chickens for your, you know, 10 pounds of lumber. One Massachusetts newspaper editor even announced that he would accept salt pork as payment for subscriptions to the newspaper. Finally, the states dealt a fatal financial blow to the Congress of the Confederation. On 2 occasions, Congress proposed amendments to the Articles that would permit Congress to levy small tariffs for revenue. In both instances, failures to attain the required unanimous vote for an amendment killed the measure. But the second failure would spur the efforts by those who desired to revise the Articles or maybe even start a new constitution. So that's where the idea of the Constitution started to become a reality, was when the Articles of Confederation would not allow the Continental Congress to acquire taxes, to have its own taxes and make money. Now, we need to jump to financial weakness, lack of hard money, and they did not have the ability to tax. Foreign weaknesses. The separate interests of the states often hampered the national government's conduct of foreign affairs. In negotiating the Treaty of Paris and in later treaty discussions, European powers such as Britain, Spain, and France learned that they could play on jealousies among the states to undercut the United States bargaining position. So basically, the states were all jealous of each other, and they were individually going to European countries and trying to craft trade deals. So it would be like Virginia trying to make a trade deal with France, and then South Carolina trying to make a trade deal with England. And the European powers recognized that they could play the jealousies of these states off of each other, as well as not making deals with the U.S. national government. So they were dividing and conquering us economically. And then, when the United States ran afoul of the Barbary pirates, as you guys remember, in northern Africa, the nation could not even pay the demanded bribes, let alone build and arm a naval squadron to protect American shipping. And that was embarrassing, and it showed military weakness, which we could not do. And that's going to spur the idea of a constitutional convention even more. Then we have domestic weakness. This is internal. Domestic means at home within your borders. So this is internal weakness that resulted in part from the economic confusion. The existence of 14 different currencies Multiple tariffs and a post-war depression weakened the financial fabric that could have bound the nation together. The most serious threat, however, was the national government's inability to keep the peace within its own borders. In 1783, a group of officers in Nuremberg, New York, grew frustrated by Congress's inability to pay their salaries and pensions, and the soldiers were backed by businessmen who feared the economic chaos that they saw looming before them. And in this was spawned the Nuremberg conspiracy. The officers intended to force Congress and the states to grant them their back pay. Some conspirators wanted more. They wanted to establish a new government under a king or a dictator. Washington was their first choice as leader, but if he refused, they would find someone else. Washington coldly rejected the offer to become a military ruler. When he learned that the officers planned a mass meeting in Nuremberg to discuss their grievances, he came as an uninvited guest. He spoke kindly to the men, sympathizing with their needs, but urging them not to destroy the nation they had fought for. At the conclusion of his speech, Washington started to reassure the men by reading a favorable letter from a congressman. Before reading it, he paused and with deliberation took out his glasses and put them on. And he said, "Gentlemen, you will permit me to put on my spectacles, for I have grown not only gray, but almost blind in service to my country." When Washington finished reading, tears filled the eyes of many of the men for reasons unrelated to the letter's contents. Before them stood the patriot who had weathered the snows of Valley Forge and faced the bullets of the British, the man whose strength of character and leadership had been the greatest weapon in the American arsenal. The Nuremberg conspiracy collapsed, but it had threatened the young and fragile government. Then we have Shays' Rebellion. This was only a few weeks before the Constitutional Convention met in 1787. So this is a couple years from the Nuremberg conspiracy, because that was 83, this is 87. The delegates, shaken by the violence, undoubtedly considered it a warning. Americans had preserved their liberty from destruction by the British after the war. They had to preserve it from destruction by themselves. The Articles of Confederation looked increasingly inadequate for the task. Just to give you a little context with Shays' Rebellion, that was a rebellion of farmers who was led by Daniel Shay, a veteran of the Revolution, and they were going against the courts in the western part of their state. In Massachusetts, the farmers had purchased land at inflated prices, and in the depression that followed, they could not meet their payment obligations. And then many of them were jailed. Others retaliated by using force to try to close the courts so that people couldn't go to jail for not paying their um, loans. But the military would end up crushing the uprising. So financial weakness, foreign weakness, and domestic weakness. This is another slide that could help you with if you really want to see side by side what the achievements and the failures of the Articles of Confederation were. Um, so we just discussed all this, but if you want to see that a little further, I think this would be great for you to know a few of these for a writing question on your test, okay? Be able to discuss a couple of the achievements and a couple of the failures of the Articles of Confederation. So, this is where we're going to pick up next time, the new charter and the Constitutional Convention. All right, guys, have a great day. Please make sure that you watch this video, and I'll see you for video 2 in a bit.